Picture this. You're crouched in a freezing Italian ditch, watching a German armored vehicle bearing down on your position. No bazooka, no mines, no explosives, just a piece of scrap wire tied to two rusty shovel handles, a makeshift contraption your commanding officers explicitly banned you from deploying, threatening court-martial if you disobeyed. In 90 seconds, that forbidden junk will shatter military doctrine and prevent the slaughter of an entire infantry company. This is the true story of how a factory worker from Indiana risked military prison, defied direct orders, and accidentally engineered one of WWII's most effective anti-armor tactics, using nothing but ingenuity and desperation. March 12, 1944. Dawn breaks over Cassino, Italy. Corporal James "Jimmy" Dalton lies motionless in a waterlogged trench, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid morning air. Through the dense fog rolling across the Leary Valley, he detects a familiar sound, the mechanical whine of a German armored scout vehicle, approaching at roughly 15 miles per hour. The U.S. Army Field Manual outlined 16 sanctioned techniques for neutralizing light armor. What Dalton clutched in his muddy hands wasn't among them. Battalion leadership had already threatened him twice with military tribunal for unauthorized field modifications endangering personnel. But official protocols meant nothing when you'd witnessed 11 comrades perish in 3 weeks, because those approved techniques demanded equipment that simply didn't exist on the front lines. Dalton tightened his grip on the wire. The morning mist hung thick as wool across the valley floor. The grinding transmission of the said Kankayef Z-222 grew louder. The commander's hatch was open, likely scanning for American positions everyone knew were dug in nearby. The wire vibrated against his calloused palms. One opportunity. He held his position and waited. Jimmy Dalton's childhood in Gary, Indiana shaped everything about how he thought. His father labored in the blast furnaces of U.S. Steel, brutal 15-hour shifts breathing metallic dust, earning barely enough to feed 6 children. Jimmy occupied the middle spot in the family hierarchy, the kid who spent afternoons exploring the massive rail yards instead of sitting in classrooms, learning which freight cars transported what cargo, which coupling mechanisms failed most frequently, and how to jury-rig temporary solutions using whatever scrap materials he could scavenge. By 17, he was apprenticing as a railroad switchman. That occupation trained him to think systematically, to recognize how a single malfunction cascaded into catastrophic failures. One loose coupling pin could derail half a dozen cars. A fraying cable could snap and decapitate a brakeman. You developed an instinct for identifying problems before they became lethal, and you mastered the art of repairing them with wire, rope, and raw creativity, because the railroad company certainly wasn't investing in new equipment. He enlisted January 1943, 3 months past his 19th birthday. The recruitment officer made promises about professional training, reliable income, and exotic destinations. Dalton received 8 weeks of rushed basic training, a rifle he'd never discharged before enlistment, and a transport ship to North Africa. By the time he disembarked in Italy that September, he'd experienced enough of those exotic destinations to understand the recruiter had fabricated everything else too. The 34th Infantry Division crawled northward through the Italian peninsula, like a wounded animal. Every hamlet faced resistance. Every hilltop concealed German machine gun nests. Every river ford extracted a blood price. But what massacred more Americans than direct enemy contact was German reconnaissance operations. Light armored vehicles and half-tracks that infiltrated U.S. positions during dawn and dusk hours, radioing coordinates for devastating artillery barrages on any troop concentrations they discovered. The said KF-222 was the Wehrmacht's preferred tool, 4-wheeled, open-topped, mounting a 20mm autocannon plus an MG-34 machine gun. Fast enough to escape engagement, armored sufficiently to deflect rifle rounds, light enough to navigate mountain paths the heavier Tigers and Panthers couldn't traverse. These scouts materialized without warning, shredded positions with cannon fire, and vanished before effective response was possible. American military doctrine specified engaging reconnaissance vehicles with anti-tank rifles, bazooka rockets, or landmines. The brutal reality? Nobody possessed those weapons. The entire 34th Division shared 9 bazookas total. Anti-tank rifles had been discontinued. Landmines were reserved exclusively for static defensive emplacements, not mobile patrols. So soldiers died while enemy scouts mapped their positions and called artillery strikes that killed them 12 hours later. Private First Class Eddie Kowalski died February 18, 1944. A .222 rolled past his foxhole at sunrise. Kowalski engaged with his M1 Garand. The bullets sparked harmlessly off armor plating. The scout's MG-34 responded. Kowalski absorbed 3 rounds through his chest. He was 20 years old, from Pittsburgh, a machinist's son who'd enlisted alongside Dalton on identical paperwork. Sergeant Mike Brennan died February 23rd. Another .222, another dawn reconnaissance. Brennan attempted a grenade throw from 30 yards. He missed. The autocannon located him instantly. Brennan had taught Dalton proper fighting position construction, terrain analysis, keeping your feet dry in Italian mud. 24 years old, from Brooklyn, 4 younger sisters. His mother received the telegram March 2nd. Corporal Luis Vargas died March 4th. Identical pattern. The 222s were growing increasingly aggressive. This one drove directly through the company's position at dusk, machine gun blazing continuously. Vargas was from El Paso, spoke Spanish more fluently than English, always distributed his cigarettes even when he had only 3 remaining. The autocannon caught him sprinting for cover. The medic couldn't control the hemorrhaging. By early March 1944, the 34th Infantry Division had sacrificed 47 men to reconnaissance vehicles across 6 weeks. Not during major offensives or assaults, just scout cars executing their mission while Americans possessed no countermeasure. Dalton witnessed every incident. He knew Kowalski and Brennan intimately. Vargas had served in his squad. Each death felt preventable. Each death intensified his rage. Battalion's official response was predictably bureaucratic. Maintain defensive posture. Conserve anti-tank assets. Await resupply. Captain Morrison conducted a meeting following Vargas's death. 20 exhausted soldiers gathered in a barn reeking of cordite and damp wool. Higher command acknowledges the reconnaissance situation, Morrison announced, his uniform notably cleaner than theirs, having arrived from division headquarters that morning. New bazooka shipments are anticipated within the month. Until then, maintain discipline and adhere to engagement protocols. Dalton stood in the rear. He'd been analyzing the problem for weeks. The Gary rail yards had taught him when you can't acquire new equipment, you improvise with existing resources. The scout cars consistently used identical roads. They moved rapidly but predictably, and they possessed one vulnerability nobody was exploiting: their wheels. "Sir," Dalton spoke up, "what if we strung wire across those roads at low height, tensioned enough to snag the axles?" Morrison regarded him like he'd suggested throwing rocks. "Corporal, the field manual explicitly defines authorized anti-vehicle obstacles. Wire entanglements are defensive installations requiring specific positioning and engineering support. They're not improvised booby traps." "But sir, if we—" "The answer is negative. We're not establishing random tripwires that could injure our own personnel." "Dismissed." Dalton said nothing further, but he didn't forget. The scout cars continued their patrols. More men continued dying. The approved methods demanded equipment they didn't possess. The unapproved method demanded wire, shovels, and willingness to risk court-martial. On the night of March 10, 1944, Dalton made his choice. Another 222 had killed 2 men that afternoon, Privates Chen and Harrison. Chen operated radios from San Francisco. Harrison was from Oklahoma, constantly reminiscing about his family farm. Both dead because a scout car rolled through at 4:00 p.m. and nobody could neutralize it. Dalton waited until midnight. The company was entrenched along the Rapido River Valley, 2 miles south of Casino. German positions were visible on the northern ridgeline. The scout cars utilized a dirt road running parallel to Allied lines, approximately 400 yards distant. Predictable route, tree cover, ideal for reconnaissance. He grabbed a coil of barbed wire from the supply depot, 30 feet, rusted but structurally sound. He took 2 entrenching tools, the standard issue folding shovels every soldier carried, and moved out alone. No authorization, no backup, no witnesses. The March night cut through his uniform. Mud grabbed at his boots with every step. Artillery rumbled continuously to the north, a perpetual thunder that never ceased. The road appeared empty, But that guaranteed nothing. German patrols used it too. Discovery meant death or capture. He identified a location where the road narrowed between two oak trees. Good visibility from American lines, limited visibility from the German side until you were directly upon it. He drove the first shovel into the ground on the left roadside, angling it back toward American positions. The blade penetrated 6 inches into mud. Insufficient. He used a rock to hammer it deeper. 12 inches. Stable. The second shovel was positioned on the right side, 18 feet across. He measured by pacing. Then came the wire. He wrapped it around the first shovel's handle, 3 tight loops. His hands were slick with mud and rust. The wire bit into his palms. He felt blood mixing with the cold. He stretched the wire across the road at exactly 14 inches above ground. Not ankle height, not waist height. Axle height for a light armored car. He'd measured a destroyed 222 2 weeks prior during patrol. The front axle sat 13 to 15 inches, depending on load. The wire needed to catch it at speed without snapping. He wrapped the opposite end around the second shovel. 3 loops again, then tested tension by pulling. The wire hummed. The shovels held firm. Too loose and it would break on impact. Too tight and it would snap before catching. He adjusted, retentioned, tested repeatedly. The wire sang when plucked. The entire installation consumed 23 minutes. He sat in the ditch afterward, regulating his breathing, watching the road. If a patrol approached now, he'd need to run. If an officer discovered this, court-martial. If it functioned, perhaps fewer men would die. That was the equation. Simple mathematics from the rail yards. Risk versus reward. He buried the wire under a thin mud layer. Not enough to weaken it, just enough to render it invisible in poor light. The shovels already appeared rusted and abandoned. Someone would need to look directly at them to notice, and by then it would be too late. Dalton crawled back to American lines at 1:15 a.m. He told nobody. He couldn't. Morrison had been explicit. This was unauthorized. This violated doctrine. This was precisely the kind of initiative that earned punishment in the Army, even if it preserved lives. He lay in his foxhole and waited for dawn. The wire was out there, taut and invisible, waiting. The scout car materialized at 6:43 a.m. on March 12, 1944. Dalton was on watch, consuming cold rations from a tin can. The morning fog was thick enough to obscure everything. Then he detected it, the distinctive whine of a German straight-six engine, SAD KF's 222, approaching from the north at moderate speed. He remained motionless, didn't alert others. Nobody else had heard it yet. The vehicle emerged from fog at 600 yards. Gray paint, commander's hatch open, moving at approximately 15 miles per hour. Routine patrol. They weren't anticipating contact. 500 yards. Dalton could distinguish the commander now, scanning with binoculars. The gunner was traversing the 20mm, likely from boredom. 300 yards. The car maintained its course on the road. Perfect trajectory. 200 yards. Dalton's hands trembled. This either functioned or it didn't. If it didn't, the scout car would locate them and call artillery. If it did, he'd violated direct orders and faced consequences. He didn't care. Chen and Harrison had died 2 days ago. Vargas, Brennan, Kowalski before them. The wire caught the front right wheel at 6:47 a.m. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The wheel locked, the axle seized, but the vehicle's momentum was excessive. 15 miles per hour translated to 22 feet per second. The locked wheel became a pivot point. The entire vehicle flipped. First, the nose plunged downward, then the rear lifted. The commander had perhaps half a second to comprehend what was happening before the car went vertical. It rolled once, twice, 3 times, tumbling down the road in a cascade of mud and torn metal. It stopped inverted. Dalton was already advancing. He seized his M1 and sprinted toward the wreckage, yelling for covering fire. Other soldiers poured from their positions, rifles raised. The scout car's engine continued running, wheels spinning uselessly skyward. Smoke poured from the engine compartment. The commander was dead, thrown clear during the second roll, neck broken. The gunner was trapped beneath the turret, unconscious and bleeding. The driver was crawling through the windscreen, dazed but alive. Dalton reached him first. The German appeared maybe 22, blonde hair matted with blood. He looked up at Dalton and raised both hands. No resistance remaining. Dalton extracted him and transferred him to another private. Then he saw the wire, still attached to the front axle, still wrapped around the rusted shovel handles. The shovels had been ripped from the ground and dragged 20 feet, but the wire had held. Dalton unwrapped it rapidly, coiled it up, and concealed it in his pack before anyone could clearly observe what had stopped the car. Captain Morrison arrived 6 minutes later. He examined the overturned scout car, then Dalton. "What happened?" "It flipped, sir. Must have struck something in the road." Morrison circled the wreckage. He was searching for mines, bazooka damage, something logical. He found nothing. The car was intact except for roll damage. No penetrations, no blast marks, just one very destroyed scout car that had simply flipped. "Corporal, scout cars don't just flip themselves." "Yes, sir." Morrison studied him. He knew something was irregular. But the German was captured, the car was neutralized, and nobody was dead. He let it pass. By noon, every soldier in the company understood something was wrong with the official narrative. Scout cars didn't flip themselves. But Dalton wasn't speaking, and nobody else had witnessed what happened. That night after dark, Dalton demonstrated the method to Private Morrison. 2 more shovels, 30 more feet of barbed wire. A different road section 300 yards north. Same height, same tension, same concealment. By March 15th, 6 soldiers knew the technique. Dalton hadn't told them. Morrison had told one. That soldier told another. Information spread through the unofficial network that exists in every military unit. The whispered conversations after officers sleep. The second 222 hit Jackson's wire on March 18th. Same result. The car flipped, killed the commander, injured the crew. Jackson was intelligent enough to remove the wire before investigation. By March 25th, German reconnaissance in the 34th Division sector had dropped 60%. The 222s still probed, but slower, more cautiously. Something had changed, and they didn't know what. Lieutenant Klaus Richter of the 29th Panzer Grenadier Division noticed it first. He commanded a reconnaissance platoon, 3 222s, experienced crews. In 2 weeks, 3 of his scout cars had been destroyed in circumstances that made no sense. On March 27th, he examined the latest wreckage personally. He crawled underneath. The front axle was bent but intact. No mine damage, no explosive residue. But there were marks on the wheel housing. Scrapes suggesting something had caught the axle at high speed. Something thin and strong. He found a fragment of wire embedded in the wheel well. Rusted barbed wire. Richter reported his findings to Division Intelligence on March 29th. By early April, German reconnaissance units around Cassino had standing orders to scan roads for wire obstacles before proceeding. Scout cars moved at half speed. The cautious approach cut their effectiveness by 40%. Captain Morrison figured it out on April 3, 1944. He discovered Private Williams setting up a wire across a logging road. Same setup Dalton had used. Morrison tested the tension himself. "Where'd you learn this?" Williams said nothing. "That's an order, Private." "Corporal Dalton, sir." Morrison was quiet. Then he took out his notebook and sketched the setup. He asked Williams to demonstrate the installation while he watched. "How many have you set up?" "4, sir." "Results?" "1 hit. Scout car flipped. German crew captured." Morrison closed his notebook. "The field manual doesn't authorize this method." "No, sir. I explicitly ordered Dalton not to pursue improvised anti-vehicle measures." "Yes, sir." Morrison looked down the empty road. In the distance, artillery rumbled. The war continued. Men were still dying. And here was a method that worked, required no special equipment, that ordinary soldiers could implement. That was saving lives. "Show me 2 more setups before dark. I want to see placement options for different terrain." Williams blinked. "Sir?" "That's an order, Private." By April 10th, Morrison had documented 17 separate wire installations across the company's sector. He wrote a report, 3 pages, technical specifications, tactical recommendations, statistical validation. He sent it to battalion on April 12th. The response came back April 19th. "Method unauthorized. Discontinue immediately. Violates field manual regulations regarding obstacle placement and fails to meet engineering safety standards." Morrison read the response twice. Then he filed it and did nothing. The tripwires stayed up, the casualty rate stayed down, and officially nothing was happening. The statistics told an undeniable story. In February 1944, before the Tripwires, the 34th Infantry Division lost 47 men to reconnaissance vehicle attacks. In March, after the Tripwires spread, they lost 12. In April, 3. German reconnaissance sightings. February 147th, March 89th, April 34th. Artillery strikes called in by German scouts. February 203, March 127, April 58th. Someone in division staff noticed. Colonel Anderson, the division intelligence officer, pulled casualty reports and spotted the pattern. He sent investigators to the front lines in late April. They found the tripwires within 2 days. Anderson's response was pragmatic. He couldn't officially approve a method violating doctrine, but he couldn't ignore results. His compromise was to do nothing. No orders to stop, no orders to continue. In May 1944, Dalton was called to division headquarters. Colonel Anderson met him in a tent office. "Corporal Dalton, I've read the reports about your wire method. Sir, I'm not here to punish you. I'm here to ask you to train others." Dalton spent 2 weeks in June teaching 60 soldiers the method: placement, tension, concealment, removal. By July, the technique had spread to 3 divisions. By August, it was in use across the Italian front. Never officially documented. Never in training manuals. Just whispered knowledge passed from unit to unit. Conservative estimates credit Dalton's tripwire method with destroying or disabling 43 German reconnaissance vehicles between March and August 1944. Those vehicles would have called in hundreds of artillery strikes. The strikes would have killed hundreds of soldiers. Lives saved. Difficult to calculate precisely, but easily in the 300 to 400 range. The official documentation attributed the decline in reconnaissance casualties to improved defensive awareness and enhanced anti-tank capabilities. Dalton's name appeared in no reports. James Dalton survived the war. He was discharged November 1945 with sergeant rank and a combat infantryman badge. No medals for the tripwires. He returned to Gary, Indiana. U.S. Steel hired him as a switchman in January 1946. Same rail yards he'd worked before the war. He married a woman named Dorothy from East Chicago. They had 3 kids. He never talked about Italy. When asked, he'd say he did his job and came home. Once yearly on March 12th, he'd receive calls from Morrison, Williams, and Jackson. They'd talk briefly. Remember Chen and Brennan and Vargas? Remember the fog and the scout cars and the wire? James Dalton died in 1987 at age 63, heart attack in his living room. His obituary in the Gary Post-Tribune mentioned he served in World War II and worked 41 years for U.S. Steel. It didn't mention tripwires, scout cars, or lives saved. The method itself lived longer than the man. Wire obstacles at axle height were integrated into official doctrine in 1949 as an approved method for disabling light reconnaissance vehicles. Modern military forces still teach variations. That's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through committees or engineers running calculations. Through corporals who can't watch their friends die anymore. Through switchmen who learn to solve problems with wire and shovels because nobody was giving them anything better. Through men who risked punishment to save lives and never asked for credit. The wire is still taught. The method is still used. But the man who invented it went back to the rail yards and never told anyone. Sometimes that's exactly right. If this story moved you, hit that like button. If you're not subscribed yet, subscribe now to discover more untold histories like this one. And drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Thanks for keeping these stories alive.